All right. Hello again, Avengers, and welcome to another exciting daily vlog. This is daily vlog number 259. Damn, we've been doing this for a little bit. So, today, first things first, update on the pillows. Um, I was supposed to run Tears of the Realms, my Zelda RPG. Supposed to run that this morning. I slept through my alarm. I slept through a Discord call notification. Everything. It was impressive. Um, so yeah, maybe the pillows are slightly too comfy. Who knows? We'll just have to wait and see. But today, I tried recording this video a couple of days ago, and it just didn't come out right. So today we're gonna muscle through it and try and do this. I want to talk about weapon mastery and just weapons in general in tabletop RPGs. And the reason why is, if any of you guys have seen my in-depth review, it is by far the most popular video I have uploaded all year. I talk about weapon mastery in, I think it's like chapter 6, whatever the equipment section is. And my biggest takeaway from weapon mastery is it's really cool in theory. In practice, it's just not. And the biggest issue I have with it is there are 38 different weapons, but there are only 8 different weapon masteries. So that means a lot of different weapons have the exact same effect. So the idea of, choosing a different weapon will allow you to use it differently doesn't quite plan out. And then, of the 8 weapon masteries, 2 of them are completely useless. They have such little effect on the game that no one will ever, nothing will change if you use weapons with those 2 masteries. There are 2 weapon masteries that can be useful in very, very specific situations. But if you don't have basically a campaign created around those situations, the masteries are not going to change anything. And then there's 4 masteries that actually change how you play your character. One of which is massive game changing. It actually changes the action economy completely. And so because of that, it massively incentivizes you to use weapons that use one of the 4 4 weapon masteries that are actually useful all the time, and it just doesn't feel very good. The thought behind it was martials are very boring to play, so we want to give them something interesting to do, because casters are always interesting to play because their spells have such varied effects and different stuff that they can do, and martials just don't get to do that. And I think weapon mastery failed on that. Not because the idea itself is bad, I just don't think they had enough time to create a robust weapon mastery system. Maybe you don't need 38 different weapon masteries, a different weapon mastery for every single weapon. But bare minimum, you should have enough for maybe half the weapons to have a different mastery to actually make it worth something to choose a different weapon that's similar. And so that got me to thinking about just overall the idea of weapons in tabletop RPGs and how you can make weapon-based classes more interesting in games that have some sort of fantastical based class, whether that's a magic based class, whether that's a technology based class, but something that doesn't just go around using a weapon. And I think the idea of the mastery system is really good. The idea that certain weapons just have a kind of inherent ability to be used differently, and that's actually supported by how actual weapons work. I studied swordplay for years. And there is a massive, massive difference between a katana and a longsword, despite the fact that they are both long weapons. They have similar blade lengths, and they're both able to be used both one and two-handed. They are massively different weapons. They are designed differently. A katana has a curve to it, and so it lends itself much better to be a slicing weapon, whereas a long sword has a straight blade, so it makes a significantly better chopping weapon. They both can thrust very well, but they both thrust very differently because the edge geometry is different and the shape of the blades is different. And so when you're using a katana, you use it in a very, very different way than when you use a longsword. In D&D, a katana and a longsword are identical. They even have in the original, can't remember if it's the PHB or the Dungeon Master's Guide, but they specifically talk about like Eastern weapons and the things like that. And they mention, if you want to use a katana, well, you can just use a longsword and reflavor it as a katana, because a katana is still going to do slashing damage as opposed to blunt or piercing damage, because they don't actually have a differentiation between chopping and slicing, despite the fact that those are two very, very different ways to cause damage with a blade. Yeah, like the idea behind weapon mastery is a good one. But from a game design standpoint, you're going to run into quite a few problems if you are creating specifically a system for martial characters to have more versatility based on the weapon that they're using, simply because martial characters are not the only people that can use weapons. Casters can use them as well, and so if the abilities of the weapons are useful enough, then the casters are going to use them in conjunction with their spellcasting and just make themselves that much cooler. If they're not useful enough that the spellcasters are going to get any benefit from them, then they're probably not going to be useful enough for the martial characters to get much out of them either. And so that becomes the biggest issue when you're dealing with a weaponry system where spellcasters have access to the exact same weapons. Maybe a more limited list of them, like wizards don't get martial weapon proficiency, but they do get access to simple weapons. Everybody gets access to simple weapons. So you have to start kind of coming up with ways to balance it out so that you're not dealing with just making everything better, which still doesn't really help the martials. So something that they did with the weapon mastery system actually kind of makes sense, is the idea that in order to use the weapon mastery, you actually have to have a class feature that gives you access to the weapon mastery. So the weapons are the same between casters and martials. However, only martials, and actually only certain martials, get to use the mastery property. So that in and of itself, I think is a good way to deal with a weaponry system where you want to have different weapons have more variety than just, well, this one does slashing damage and this one does piercing damage. So having some sort of feature that's baked into a martial class where it allows them to use them differently than the casters fixes that problem. It also makes sense from an in-game and lore perspective. Of course, a character that's actually been trained to use these weapons as their sole form of defense is going to be able to use them in ways that someone that's not trained isn't. So that in and of itself makes perfect sense. The thing where 5th edition kind of drops the ball is they did this thing where they're like, well, if you're a fighter, you can learn 3 weapon mastery properties, but you only learn 3, and it's only 3 weapon mastery properties for 3 weapons. It's not even that you can use any weapon that has the sap property or the nick. No, you choose 3 weapon types, and those are the mastery properties. So of the 38, you theoretically could choose 3 that have the exact same weapon property, and it would be completely useless. But the interesting thing about that is every single character that gets the mastery property also gets the ability to change at least one of their masteries that they can use after a long rest. So the limitation isn't really a limitation. It takes one long rest to be able to use a weapon that you couldn't use before, and that's not that big a deal. And again, in most D&D campaigns, you're not constantly switching weapons. You use one weapon until you find a better weapon. The mastery system theoretically had a chance to change that by creating instances where, well, in this particular instance, this weapon, because it has a unique property, is going to be more useful to me than this weapon. But again, none of that really happened. Most of the most useful weapon mastery properties are just you can do more damage in some way, shape, or form, whether that's getting extra attacks, attacking additional to the target, stuff like that. Or one of them is just you get advantage on your next attack roll. Which again is very useful, but it doesn't actually change how you play, and there's no real reason to switch to another weapon just so you can get advantage in the middle of combat. So, taking that idea, I think in a mythological tabletop RPG that we designed and it is perfect, I like the idea of martial classes have a feature that says, by the way, when you use weapons, you can use their special properties that's exclusive to martial classes. I think that works well. I think every weapon type should have its own property. And I think the various, like the 38 different weapons in the D&D, a lot of them are things like hand crossbow, light crossbow, heavy crossbow. They're the same thing. One of them is one-handed, 2 of them are two-handed, and the only difference is how much damage they do. The same is true about the short bow and the long bow. They're the same weapon, just one has a larger damage die. And we see this kind of constantly, where either they will change a damage type, or or they will change whether it's one or two-handed, and then that means it's an entirely different weapon. I don't think it needs to be that. I don't think there needs to be 38 different weapon mastery properties, if that is it. But I do think you need to find a way to kind of categorize weapons, like one-handed bladed weapons. Whether they are piercing or slashing, we'll do that, because they both kind of work in the same way. And then we will just have that as a category, and they have one or two different, a few different weapon mastery properties for one-handed bladed weapons. And then two-handed bladed weapons, similar thing. One-handed blunt weapons, two-handed blunt weapons. And then ranged weapons, you could have crossbows and longbows if you're not doing any sort of gunpowder or anything like that. So now instead of needing 38 different ones, we're classifying it down to maybe exactly what they had, about 8, but then the mastery properties in and of themselves, or the special abilities of the weapons, actually have to be something useful. And I mean, I'm gonna to make this easier on me, I'm actually going to bring up the weapon mastery properties so we can look at them as kind of a guide, because there's another system that I'm going to be bringing up in a little bit that I think does this better, and I think most of you can guess what it is. But so mastery properties: cleave, graze, nick, push, sap, slow, topple, vex. So when we look at the 8 different weapon mastery properties, cleave just gives you an additional attack, but it's only if there's another person within 5 feet. But that's just extra damage. Graze, you do damage even with you miss. So that's just extra damage. Nick you can make your extra attack as part of the attack action instead of a bonus action, and it gives you an entire free bonus action to do something. But again, as far as what the weapon is doing, it's basically just extra damage. It's shifting where the damage happens. Push is the first one. So, of the first 4 mastery properties, all of them are just, here's more damage. There are different ways to get the damage, but it's still just, here's more damage. It doesn't really change, or I guess the first 3. It doesn't really change how you play the character. It's just, here's more damage. That's boring. And I'm not saying that you can't have a here's more damage weapon mastery, but when you have 3 of your 8 weapon masteries are just here's more damage, it's not very useful. The next one after that is push. That one is it actually changes how you play the game. And using a push weapon in combination with like a cleave weapon can be very, very useful, because you can enemies in general don't like to stand right next to each other because fireball is the thing. So they generally tend to spread out at least a little bit. So by using push, you can knock 2 of them together and then come up and cleave, and you get to hit both of them with the attack. That in and of itself is actually useful. It changes how you play the character. It interacts with a different weapon mastery property. That actually incentivizes you to do something a little bit different. So push, in my mind, push is a really, really valuable weapon mastery property because it actually changes how you play the character. Sap, hit a creature with this weapon. The creature is disadvantaged at its next attack roll before the start of your next turn. Next to useless in D&D 5th edition because it only works on 1 attack, and by 5th level, creatures are already getting multi-attacks. Once you get to really high level stuff, they're getting 4 or 5 attacks in a turn. This does next to nothing. And from a mechanical standpoint, it doesn't actually change how you play the character that much. The one time Sap is really going to change how you play the character is if you do have something like a spellcaster or a character that only gets 1 attack, which is extremely rare. It's almost exclusively spellcasters, and that character's attack uses an attack roll, which is another thing that is extremely rare. If it's only 1 attack, it's almost always an area, and it's almost always a saving throw instead. So in that very specific instance, you might use Sap to give them disadvantage on their single attack, and that would be useful, but it's such a niche specific situation, and again, it doesn't actually change how you play the character. It just, in very, very rare instances, will change your target, and that's it. So in my mind, that in and of itself is not really that useful. If it was disadvantage on all their attack rolls, that would be a different thing, and then it would change how you play the character, because then you're focusing on, okay, which one of these guys has the most attacks, or which one of these guys has the most devastating attacks, and it again, it's changing your target, but it's forcing you to kind of understand everything that's going on, and it's always useful. Slow is just about useless. It reduces a single creature's speed by 10 feet for a turn. And again, once you get to 5th level, you have characters, you have a lot of monsters that have 40, 50 movement speed, and you are limited to 30. So getting rid of 10 feet of movement really isn't that useful. Something to the effect of they lose half their movement speed might be significantly useful. Or the very next property, Topple, hit a creature, they make a con save, they fail it, they're prone. Prone affects their speed. When you are prone, you can only crawl. Crawling, you move at half speed. In order to stand up from prone, it costs you half of your speed. It doesn't cost you 10 feet of speed. It doesn't cost you 5 feet of speed. It is half. So the Topple mastery, again, actually changes how you play the character. Because by being able to knock them prone, there are advantages and disadvantages to having a prone target. If you're a melee character, having them prone means you have advantage on your attack rolls. As long as you're within 5 feet, you get advantage on attack rolls. It's very, very nice. Any attacks that they make from the prone condition have disadvantage. That is a very useful thing. Ranged characters roll disadvantage against prone targets, so it's not as useful. So the topple condition in and of itself is basically does everything the slow condition does by reducing their speed, plus gives a bunch of other really useful things. And if you combine it with a grapple, it actually changes how that character plays, because you cannot get up from prone if you have 0 movement, and if you're grappled, you have 0 movement. So it forces them to use their action or something to break the grapple before they're ever able to move. It changes the action economy. That's a really, really big deal. Slow simply doesn't. Then the final one is Vex. You have advantage on your next attack roll. Again, that is useful, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't actually change how you play your character. It just makes it easier for you to hit. So when we look at the 8 different mastery properties, you really only have 2 that actually make you play your character differently. You have Topple and you have Push. And technically the first 3 in combination with either Topple or Push can be useful, because toppling something over and then having a character that can do extra damage is nice. But something like Graze is only useful if you miss, which means a character with Topple interacting with a character that has Graze, it's actually making their ability less useful, because they're going to be hitting more often, and Graze is only useful if you miss. It also means at higher level, when you just stop missing for the most part, Graze is next to useless. So, yeah, when we actually look at a system like Weapon Mastery or something similar to it, where different weapons give you different abilities, I think the most important aspect of it is it has to make you want to play the character differently because of the weapon that you're using. A really easy example is the difference between a melee and a ranged weapon. A person using a ranged weapon will play their character differently than a person using a melee weapon. By definition, melee you have to be close, ranged you want to be far away. That's what weapon masteries really need to do, or some kind of equipment system or weaponry system. That's what they need to do to actually be useful. Is, well, when I have this weapon, I can do something differently, and that makes me play my character differently. If it's just going to do the exact same thing you would do without the mastery property, then there's no purpose for having the mastery property. And that's one of my biggest issues with just like extra damage mastery properties. It doesn't actually change how you play your character. It just makes the guy die faster. So when we're talking about weapon properties and stuff like that, if we want to look at another system that I think does this better, it's not the best system in the world for it, but it does do it better than D&D 5th edition. We go over to Essence 20, and specifically we look at their damage type system. And I'm actually going to open up probably Transformers, because that's the one that's easiest for me to look at. Essence 20. I was totally prepared for this, guys. Trust me. Let's open this up. Boom. We go to equipment, and we're just going to look at the damage types. So, internal hard points, blah, 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 blah. Effects and traits. Elements. Okay, so the element system in the Essence 20 system, I think, is a really, really great example of a weaponry style system where using a different weapon actually changes how you play your character. We'll go over each of the different things real quick here, but elements, acid, does extra damage when you hit a target that defends with toughness. Cold adds a stun effect as an alternate effect to the weapon, or increases the stun effect if it already has it. Electric, you can get an upshift on your attacks using electric. Electromagnetic, it ignores certain defenses and things like that. It's more complicated than that, but we're not going to get into it right now. Fire deals extra damage when somebody defends with evasion. Laser gets a stun effect, but they can also be used to basically paint a target. They call it spotting a target, to help someone else hit the target. And Sonic allows you to actually target a defense you normally couldn't. You can target the willpower defense. So when you look at this, there's a couple different things. You have methods that if they use a certain type of defense, they will take extra damage. So we already talked about extra damage generally isn't the greatest thing for a weaponry system, because all it does is, well, I'm going to use the exact same weapon, but it's going to going to take less time. And that's all it does. But the interesting thing about both acid and fire is they're specifically designed around two different defenses. And that's one of the things I think Essence 20 does so well, because there's 4 different defenses. Most of your attacks are going to go up against either your the toughness defense or the evasion defense. And that's actually chosen by the person defending. And the difference between them, toughness defense is, I'm going to just grit and bear through it. Toughness defense is like using a shield to kind of take it and go, I'm not going to let it hurt me. Evasion defense is exactly that. You dodge out of the way. So when you're playing a tabletop RPG, it's on the shoulders of the dungeon master, when you were talking about the combat and kind of describing what's going on, that if they're using their evasion defense, if they get hit by it or missed by it, you should be putting something in there. Well, they attempt to dodge out of the way, but you're able to hit them as they're moving out of the way, and it's a hit and it does damage. Or if they're using their toughness defense, well, as they see the bolt coming at them, they just kind of grit down, they turn their shoulder into it, and they take the blow on their shoulder, and their armor-plated shoulder just ricochets it off, doing no damage. Things like that will indicate to the players, okay, this particular enemy likes to use this particular defense. And then by either using an acid or a fire weapon, you now are having the players, first of all, have to be able to understand what's going on, and actually pay attention to how their shots are missing. And it's incentivizing the players to use a different kind of attack. And when they use these kinds of weapons, it also incentivizes the enemy to use different kinds of defenses. You know, if it's a really, really high roll, you're going to get hit either way. Choosing the evasion defense when they're using an acid weapon is actually going to be beneficial to the defending enemy, because they're going to take less damage for it. So as much as, yes, this is just extra damage, it's extra damage that depends on how the enemy is defending. And these exact same damage types can be used against the player as well, which will force them to kind of sit there thinking, oh, maybe against this guy that's just shooting copious amounts of fire at me, maybe I want to stop trying to evade everything and just kind of sit down and knuckle through the flames, because I'm going to take less damage. So a weaponry system that has increased damage, but increased damage because of certain conditions, I think creates a compelling compelling thing that's going to force the players to actually think about what they're doing. The cold damage introduces a debuff, and I think that is something that the weapon mastery system is solely lacking. And part of that is due to the fact that D&D 5th edition really doesn't have that many different conditions that you can deal with. I mean, for the most part, you have the grappled and restrained condition, which are just two different versions of the same condition. You have difficult terrain, which is basically slowing. You have the poisoned condition, and then you have various versions of unconscious. You have stunned, paralyzed, stuff like that. That's really it. As far as things that are actually going to change how things worked, obviously grappled, restrained, they can't move. But like the poison condition is just we have disadvantage on everything. Okay, and it's useful, but it's also like the idea of that is very useful, but it also there's so many different creatures that have immunity to it or have resistance and advantage on saving against poison and that there's so few times that you actually use the poison condition. And then stunning and all that, it's the exact same thing. You just take them out of combat. As far as different things that can happen, there just really isn't. Either you can, as far as mechanics are concerned, you can stop them from moving, give them disadvantage, or stop them from doing everything. It's only 3 different things that you can do in D&D 5th edition. I don't think that's that great. I tend to prefer systems that have a lot of different debuffs and the things like that can actually change how you play. Like Fabula Ultima technically only has 4 different debuffs. But they massively change how the game is played because they actually reduce the dice that you use to roll your attacks to do everything in the game. So it's actually a really, really big change. So when we're talking about the Essence 20 system, the stun effect just removes their ability to move. For a set number of turns, and if you can get their stun effect up to their hit point total, it takes them out of combat. So that's another thing you can do with a weaponry system is let the weapons enact debuffs of some kind. Whether it is things that make them weaker or persistent damage or a lot of other things. Like it requires you to have a pretty decent conditions system built into the game, but it makes creating interesting and unique weapons that much more fun because now they do have something that they can do, and you can have an impact based weapon or a blunt weapon do different things than a slashing weapon. A slashing weapon might, make them bleed out or something, and the loss of blood could make them, I don't know, have a harder time hitting targets because their vision starts to blur, or will make them take persistent damage because they're bleeding out, or a million other things. But those things make it kind of interesting as a weapons-based character, because now you have a choice between, okay, do I want to do this one? Do I want to do that one? The Open Legends system, their Bane system is so great as far as giving you a lot of different options for effects that can happen based on something, and you can build custom weapons that have Banes built into them. And so in a system like that, it's very, very easy to give martial characters a lot of versatility because they have so many different Banes that they can choose from. The other thing that's nice about the Open Legends system is everything is based on your stats, so your weapon is kind of secondary. You can be a weapon-based character that just uses agility a lot and then inflict different Banes based on your agility and other stuff like that. You kind of get to make it up as you go. It's one of the reasons I love that system so much. I really miss playing in it. Not Not that I don't absolutely adore the Cypher system. It's also super amazing and fun, but Open Legend will always have a spot in my heart. So, yeah, so looking at the rest of this, electric and electromagnetic both are just things that technically make it easier to hit the target where you're getting upshifts. However, because of how the skill system works in Essence 20, it is not exclusively this is a bonus to your roll. When you combine it with things like specialization and that, it also means that you can get a critical hit more easily with it. And the nice thing about critical hits in the Essence 20 system is one of the things you can do is you can cause an additional effect to happen from the weapon. And so any weapon that has alternate effects for when you hit with them, when you get a critical hit, you can choose from multiple effects. And I think that's another thing that tends to be very, very beneficial, specifically in the Essence 20 system, but just in general, if you're trying to design a weapon system in your tabletop RPG, having choices of what the weapon does when it hits the target can actually be really, really beneficial. The Open Legend does a similar thing where if you roll, I think it's 10 above the... if you roll 10 above the defense that you're attacking, you get to automatically apply a Bane that you could normally apply using that ability score. And so because of that, when you do really, really well, you now have, I have all these different Banes available to me. I think I'm going to do this one. And it makes for a very dynamic game. So, yeah, even though, again, the idea of just, well, it's easier to hit with this weapon normally would not be a massive change to how you play the character, but when you start adding multiple effects to the weapons in question, well, being able to hit more accurately and that actually affecting how often you can get a critical hit, which allows you to do multiple things, that actually does change how you play your character, because now you're going to be doing everything you can to get additional upshifts and stuff like that, so you can do these kind of combination attacks. Laser's another one that's really, really interesting. Again, it gives stun effects, so it has one of the things it can do is just applied a condition or a debuff, so we've already seen that. But the other alternate effect it has is it can be used to spot. It can be used to basically paint the target, which helps your allies hit it. So that's another thing that was a common thing, specifically if you look into gladiatorial combat. One of the weapons of gladiators was a net. And when it was just one-on-one gladiators, the net was kind of good because you could use it to trap an opponent's weapon or tangle them up and then stab them. But if you had, which did happen, when you had multiple gladiators going up against either another group of gladiators or against animals or whatever it was, you know, the ability to use your weapon to trip up the enemy while your ally goes in and attacks is really, really useful. And then when you look at a tabletop RPG, the ability for you to effectively kind of sacrifice your attack to give your ally some sort of a benefit is really, really useful. And it also it encourages teamwork at the table. It also encourages the person that has the ability to sacrifice their turn to give someone else a benefit. It forces them to understand the rest of their team, because in order to get the most out of their character, they need to make sure that they are using, they are helping the right ally. Because if they have someone that's just always hitting already, and their benefit is it makes it easier for someone to hit, then it's really not going to benefit the person that already hits most of the time. However, if you have another person that has an ability like the old version of Great Weapon Master, where they take a penalty to their attack roll, but it does a lot more damage, well, then helping that particular character out is actually going to make them make a different decision, because they're going to go, well, now it's easier for me to hit, so it's not as bad when I take my little debuff here to be able to make this stronger attack. So again, if you're designing a weapon mastery system or a weaponry system, having weapons who have the ability to basically just set up other people for wins or support-based weapons can be very, very useful, and will definitely change how you play. You know, off the top of my head, having a character that can use a whip that either can wrap around a weapon to prevent the enemy from attacking, or kind of just putting them, kind of wrapping them up to make it easier to attack them. It's one thing you can do. But another thing that I think a lot of people don't think about when you're discussing like a bullwhip, the entire purpose of a whip, and I guess not really a bullwhip, but if you're talking about whips like they use in like animal husbandry, the whip itself is not designed to hurt the animal. What it's designed to do is startle the animal from a very specific spot. The way that a whip works is through conservation of momentum. You start some kinetic energy at the base of it, which has a lot of mass. And then that kinetic energy travels all the way down the whip. But as it's traveling down, the mass of the whip is getting thinner and thinner and thinner. And so because all of this kinetic energy is based on just the mass of the whip at the base, as the mass decreases, the amount of energy being put into a small area gets higher and higher and higher until you get to the very, very end, and it actually causes the tip, the cracker of the whip, to break the sound barrier with how fast it moves. That's how whips work. That's how they make that cracking sound. And in animal husbandry, you're generally not hitting your animals with the whips. There are times when that happens, but that's not actually the best way to use it. Generally what it is you will crack the whip near them at a specific spot, and it will cause them to move away from the very, very loud sound. In a combat situation, being able to create a sonic boom in a very specific area, which is the entire purpose of getting really good with a whip, is the ability to crack it in the specific place that you want it to crack. So the ability to create a sonic boom in a very specific spot is unbelievably useful. It can distract an enemy. It can actually direct the enemy to move away, because we will automatically, our bodies are wired through reflexes and things like that to try and keep us alive. And sonic booms and whip cracks are remarkably loud, like really, really, really loud. And so if you're fighting someone and then out of nowhere this explosion happens right next to your head, you are going to jerk out of the way reflexively. So having a whip style weapon whose ability is either to distract the enemy or even kind of move the enemy, which we'll talk about in a second here, would be a very, very interesting thing. And again, having a weapon like a whip where you have the choice between, well, I can stop them from moving or I can force them to move, that creates situations for weapon-based character classes that are interesting. Now they have choices, and they have to know what's going on in the battlefield to figure out which one of those choices is going to be the most useful. And then the final element in Essence 20 is Sonic, and again, all it does is allow you to target a different defense, but it's a defense you normally can't target with weapons. And again, that in and of itself is another thing that's really, really interesting for a weapon-based character. The ability to target something that they normally can't can be something that, again, rewards the player for understanding what is going on there. And it also rewards the DM for describing combat in a way that they can understand how the defenses are working. If you just go, oh, you miss, oh, you hit, without any side of description, well, the player has no idea, am I missing because this person is jumping out of the way? They have a super, super high evasion. Am I missing because their armor is just so incredibly thick that nothing I do is going to do anything? Why am I missing? And so by having weapons that have the ability to target different defenses or be able to get around certain things, very similar. If you guys have watched my Essential Lessons 20 on the Analyst for Transformers, the Analyst has an ability where they can burn a free action to be able to ignore a piece of armor that's basically increasing one of the defenses. Having a weapon that has the ability to bypass some sort of defense or be able to target a different defense or remove their ability to add a certain number to their defense, anything like that can make for a very interesting weapon. It can also make for a very, very boring weapon because at the end of the day, it can turn into, oh, it's just easier for me to hit with this weapon. So you do need to create something in there that requires a conscious choice or requires some sort of observation. Like, again, with the Sonic, learning whether or not they have a high willpower defense is useful, especially since in order to attack the willpower defense, you have to take a downshift 2 to do that. So you're already having a penalty to be able to target a different defense, but it might be beneficial. So things like that in a weaponry system are very, very interesting and cool. And then again, the final thing that's not really demonstrated in the element system at Essence 20, but I think they have to have, I think they call it maneuver. Well, they don't have it here. But they do have traits that allow you to basically... Oh, yeah, there it is. Maneuver. So basically, it's a weapon that allows you to actually move the target around. And we talked about the idea of the push weapon mastery in 5th edition being an actually useful thing because it actually changes how you play your character. Especially since the push weapon mastery requires you to push them away from you. So it will actually change where you stand in relation to the enemy if you want to push them in a certain direction. The maneuver the maneuver feature actually has 3 different ways that it can be used: grappling, shoving, or tripping. So 3 different ways to deal with movement. But again, if you're going to be creating a weaponry system, having the ability for this particular weapon to move an enemy laterally, whereas this weapon moves them either closer or further away from you, those are going to be things that makes the player actually have to make a choice. Do I want this person closer to me? Do I want this person farther away from me? Do I want them moved over here? Is it going to help me if they're in a different spot on the battlefield? And also movement-based masteries and things like that are highly beneficial when you actually have interesting maps to have combat on, whether there are cliffs that you can throw them off or places that narrow gaps that you can use to bottleneck enemies, or simply places where you can put them where it breaks their line of sight with someone else so that that person can do something without this enemy being able to interact with them. Really good example of that. Counterspell requires you to be able to see the person casting the spell. So I have seen players do this in D&D Adventures League games where they wanted to cast a fireball, but there was this one guy that was just counterspelling them every single time they did. So all they did is they went around the corner, and because fireball is an area effect, they didn't actually have to see any of the people that they were aiming at. They just had to know roughly where they were and then move to a point where the other enemy couldn't see them, and then cast the fireball near enough that the area of effect is going to hit them. So yeah, the ability to maneuver the enemy can be very useful, but it does require the GM to create environments where they're standing is actually useful. and actually means something. So, yeah. Like I said, I love the idea of weapon mastery. The execution is just bad in this one. And I'm not sure, at least in 5th edition did a D&D, I'm not sure it could get much better, to be blunt. Because again, 5th edition has this property where there are very, very limited conditions that actually have a mechanical change on how the game is played, and that's a really useful thing in general for weaponry systems. But even without that, like they added in damage over time effects, which they basically took out in 5th edition in general. Searing Smite now does damage over time, which I don't know if that was how it worked before. But I thought that it really didn't do that very much, or it only lasted for a single other turn or something like that. So damage over time things can be something that you can put into weapon effects, or just actually creating specific things that are specific conditions that are unique to the weapons themselves. Basically invent new conditions, but the only way you can get those conditions is from a weapon mastery effect. So it doesn't have to be something that everyone can use. Those are the kind of things that I think could make the weapon mastery system significantly better. But if you're designing your own tabletop RPG, which is where most of these discussions tend to go, these are the things that you would want to do in order to implement an interesting weapon mastery style or a weaponry system into your game. And if you are like me and you like to learn new tabletop RPGs, this is something that you can use to kind of grade and examine a new tabletop RPG. If they have a long list of different conditions that can be, even if they don't have a system like it in there, you can use those different conditions to create your own weaponry system without that much difficulty. Whereas, again, in something like 5th edition, there's a lot more work because you have to come up with new properties that just don't exist in the game, and you have to make sure that those new properties are not going to conflict or synergize in ways that you don't want them to with existing things built into the system, stuff like that. So, interested to hear your guys' opinion. Do you like the weapon mastery system in 5.5? Do you like the element system in Essence to 20, or the Bane system in Open Legend? Do you like things like that? Or do you think martial-based classes should be significantly more simple, that the benefit of playing a caster is it gets to be more complex? Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, again, that is all for me today. I will see you guys in the next time. All right? Bye-bye.